So, we've looked at that personal decision making when confronted with war. What did Franz Jägerstätter do? What would you do? But then we also need some kind of wider understanding of what war is, of what violence is. As peace educators, we need a way to unpick this proposition that war is just part of reality, is part of life. Where does war actually come from? And from that, we're going to draw on something that we did mention in the first session when we were defining peace education, the idea of the different violences: direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence. We're drawing on the work of the Norwegian academic Johan Galtung here, who in the 1970s kind of really brought peace studies as a discourse alive and into the world. So it's a bit like the onion that we looked at before in interpersonal conflict, in that the direct violence is the stuff you see. Yeah, it's the fighting in war, the physical fighting on a country's streets. But that is connected to other types of violence: structural violence and cultural violence. Structural violence I would define as the way we build the world, construct the world. Is it fair or is it unequal, inequitable? The most obvious example is just poverty. If people don't have enough resources, if their needs aren't being met, then you have a structural inequality. In fact, studies by people like Amartya Sen, who wrote Development as Freedom, pointed out that even when there have been cases of severe famine, it tends not to be because there isn't enough food in the world to feed those people, but because it's not being distributed fairly. People don't have the freedom or the rights to claim that resource, that need of food at their time of greatest need. Even in the Ethiopian famine, there was food quite close by, but the social capital of the people involved in allowed them to access it. So there's violence involved in that. It is a structural violence. You could say it's other ways that we build the world. For example, is there enough disabled access? If we haven't built disabled access into our buildings, into our streets, then we have excluded a whole group of people from accessing a lot of places. That could be said to be a kind of structural violence. But where does that come from? Well, there needs to be something going on in our heads, and that's the cultural violence, the way we see the world. Sometimes it's just a kind of blindness. So if you've never thought about how a disabled person might access the world, then you have a kind of cultural violence about your own norms, about your own experience, that leads you to exclude them in the way you act or the way you work with other people to build the world. It's also about all those violent attitudes to the other. So whether it's to a homeless person, whether it's to someone of a different gender or sexuality to you, whether it's someone of a different ethnicity or heritage or background to you, or someone of a different age to you, our cultural valuing, all that stuff about stereotypes, is cultural violence. And that is what enables both direct violence and structural violence, because we wouldn't find it conscionable to perpetrate those things if we didn't have those cultural norms already working in our heads. This is quite a sophisticated idea, so it might not be something that you explore in primary school, but certainly in secondary school you can start to look at where do these different types of violences happen, both at the level of a school, at the local level, and in the wider world. So if we take an example of a conflict that famously involves direct armed violence, that between Israelis and Palestinians, we can see examples of each type of violence. So when Palestinians find it harder to travel to work, to access healthcare or water, that's structural violence. When Palestinians or Israelis use racist language, that's cultural violence. And of course, when either side physically attack the other, that's direct violence. Here's a sorting activity we might use with young people at a secondary level again to explore this idea. So we'd like you to undertake that now, categorising each one into cultural, structural, and direct. So using that macro framework of the different types of violence from Johan Galtung, it's easy to have a conversation with young people about where does the direct violence, the war, come from. And you can start to look back at what the antecedents are. There's a great organisation called Facing History and Ourselves that started in the US but have a very active chapter in the United Kingdom as well. And they look very closely at particular instances of mass violence and genocide in human history, but they look at it in a very rigorous and thorough and engaging way that doesn't just say the Holocaust was a terrible thing and an illustration of how evil people can be, but it looks at the history that took people to that point, and it does that at the individual level. So in our first session we looked at issues of identity, so what makes up a person's identity. Their race, their gender, their age, their religion, all of those things put together. How do identities respond to each other? How do they interact? And then what are the norms and values of your community? At what point would you act as an upstander or as a bystander in an instance of conflict? And all of that work puts you in a place where when you get to the moment of decision about war or mass violence, you have a better understanding of the choices people are making there as well. So war becomes not a force of nature, but something about the net sum of human choices. So we've considered war a little, we considered what violence is and how it can be broken down. But what about non-violence? Non-violence is certainly something that I think schools often don't explore in a great deal of detail, and when they do, it's kind of as a nice historical curiosity, like something that Martin Luther King did or something that Gandhi did, and their work was done. But somehow it doesn't get transplanted into our current times. We're not given the proposition that non-violence can be a tool for change today. The dominant narrative suggests that there are only two choices, fight or be totally passive. But of course non-violence can be active. We're going to show you a clip that illustrates active non-violent change and shows that non-violence doesn't have to be passive or indeed cowardly. It can be active and it can be courageous. And then you can have a conversation using that language of structural violence and cultural violence and direct violence to explore how change happens, how violence and injustice can be challenged non-violently.